Hey, Hope Church, just wanted to come to you and give you another midweek devotional thought. We've been working our way through 2 Corinthians chapter 1 in thinking about Paul's understanding and his experience with suffering and kind of going through some of those things of why we suffer and how we think about and how we continue to endure in the middle of suffering. When we get down to verse 9, he says something here that I think we all need to consider because we have a view of the Christian life that is very much colored by our American reality. We think that if we are good Christians, if we do the right things, if we follow the right rules, then we will have a good life. And when we define good life, what we usually mean by that is we'll be healthy, wealthy, and wise. That comes out a lot when you look at pastors and preachers that are considered health and wealth preachers. They say, you know, if you follow Christ, if you give the right amount of money, then these are the things that will happen in your life. But I think it even comes out in much milder ways in very mainstream Christianity when we think if we do the right things, our kids will be good, our life will be happy, we won't suffer, we won't be sick. And honestly, we'll just always be happy. But when I come to a passage like this in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 9, it tells me something very different. Listen to what Paul says when he talks about suffering and living in the middle of that suffering. He says, "Indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death, but that was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead." He's been talking all about his experience in his travels, and he was a man that had experienced being physically and personally to the point of danger and death. He had traveled, he had been shipwrecked, he had been beaten for his faith. And so all of these things he had experienced in the path of following God. But I think when he comes here, he is talking about some of those physical things, but I think it's deeper here because what he says here is, indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death. He knew what it was to be under a sentence of death. He knew what it meant to be basically looking and sitting on death row and had been released from that at different times in his life. I don't think that's what he's talking about here. I think he's talking about something much more internal, much more emotional, much more spiritual, because he says there that we felt that we had received the sentence of death. If he was talking about a literal sentence of death, I don't think he would have used the word felt. And what that communicates is that in the Christian life, there are times where things feel desperate. And I don't know if you have been there, but I have been there at times where I look around at circumstances, I look around at life, and I feel desperate. And in a sense, feel like I'm dying. And when I look at a verse like this, there's a sense of hope here because I can identify with what the Apostle Paul says. He says that we felt as if the sentence of death has been lowered on us. And so I guess the first thing that I want to say to you is if you are in that place, you're not alone. And secondly, you're not a bad Christian. I think sometimes we think that, well, if I'm a good Christian, then I'm going to have happiness all the time. Sometimes we even put it in the language of joy. I'm going to be joyous and I'm going to be smiling all the time. And yet what Paul says here is he felt the sentence of death. He had a dark cloud hanging over him. He felt desperate and he felt that he didn't know what to do. But I want you to also hear the second part of this verse. He says, the reason that was there, that existed, was that it would make us to rely not on ourselves, but rely on God who raises the dead. The hope that comes in the second half of that verse is the purpose for that pain, the purpose for that suffering, the purpose for that feeling is to pull us away from ourselves. Oftentimes in pain, in suffering, we come into ourselves. We look into ourselves. We examine ourselves. And what Paul is saying here is actually the intention of that suffering is actually to point us away from ourselves. It's to point us towards God, because God is the one who literally raises the dead. He says here, this idea is looking to the gospel, looking to the reality of Christ, that in his perfect life, in his sacrificial death, and now in his resurrection, there's hope to be had that goes beyond the difficulties and beyond the suffering that we experience in this life. He says here in verse 10, he delivered us from such a deadly peril, and he will deliver us. On him we have set our hope that he will deliver us again. So when Paul felt this, his probably natural tendency, like all of us, was to pull inside. But what he had forced himself to do was look beyond himself, look towards Christ, and remember and trust in and hope in the God who raises the dead. So if you're in the middle of suffering, what I want to encourage you to do is, in a sense, pull down the mirror instead of trying to look inside. Look not down the mirror, but out the window. Look out the window in terms of the gospel, and look outside of yourself. Look towards what God has done in Christ, remembering the hope. That doesn't mean that the difficulties go away. Paul was still in suffering. Paul would still experience suffering. He's going to go on, and we're going to deal with some of that as we go forward. He felt the crush of that suffering, but what he did have is he had hope, because he looked to the gospel, not to try to fix it within himself. And so I want to encourage you with that, to think about your suffering in that way. If you're feeling difficult, in a difficult place, you're feeling bad, you're not unchristian. But I want you to see that suffering in light of what the gospel is. And so I hope that's an encouragement to you today. I hope that focuses you on not yourself, but I hope it focuses you on God, the one who raises the dead.